So, hello everyone. This is Shannon Vance Ocampo. I use she and her pronouns, and I am the General Presbyter for the Presbytery of Southern New England. And this is Connecting Our Conversations, our podcast space for conversations that push the edges of our faith and help us to deepen discipleship. The Presbytery of Southern New England is a regional governing body in the Presbyterian Church, USA. Today for our podcast, we are welcoming the Presbytery team that just got back from the 226th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA, our every 2 years annual meeting of the National Church where we decide all sorts of things. And so we have our two commissioners with us, the Reverend Ann Weirich and Elder Nicole Aronson, and also our stated clerk, the Reverend Kate Carlisle. We're going to take some time during this podcast to talk about the General Assembly, about what happened, and about what's next after the Assembly. So welcome, Anne, welcome, Nicole, and welcome, Kate. So I love to get started with introductions, and I'd like to just get started by giving each of you an opportunity to introduce yourself in whatever way best makes sense for you. So Nicole, we'll get started with you. So tell us about who you are.
Thanks, Shannon. My name is Nicole Aronson Champagne. I use she, her pronouns. I am an elder worshiping at Westminster Presbyterian Church in West Hartford, Connecticut. I also serve as the chair of our Presbytery's Nominating Committee. And this was my first General Assembly. 2 years ago, I attended Synod, so I'm kind of working my way up.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. Anne, tell us about you.
Hi, I'm Reverend Ann Weirich, and I am honorably retired, and I live on Cape Cod. My pronouns are she, her, and I serve on the Commission on Ministry for the Presbytery. This was my second General Assembly as a commissioner and my first General Assembly as for moderating a committee.
Great. And Kate, go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Reverend Kate Carlisle. I use they, them pronouns. I serve as stated clerk for PSNE and also for Boston Presbytery, and I live in Boston.
Great. Thanks, Kate. So I thought we'd start out with just talking about the assembly itself. So for those who are listening, the way General Assembly works is that everyone gets sorted once you're nominated to go to the assembly. There's this computer that sorts everybody and puts you in committee assignments. And there's I think it's about 14 or so committees of the General Assembly. And folks get assigned to committees. And first the committees meet and work with the business that they're assigned to. And then they move the business up to the plenary, which is the second half of the assembly. So everyone was assigned to different committees. And then some of us as staff members watch particular committees or sometimes resource them. So that we talk and begin with our committee work. And Nicole, I'd love to hear about your committee assignment. You were assigned to the environmental committee, and what was in front of you? What were some of the decisions you made? Some of the highlights of your work? What were you up to on the environmental committee?
Yeah, I was really excited to be on the Environment and Climate Justice Committee. Lots of exciting things happening. During our time of committee work, we considered 6 overtures, and 4 of them went to the consent agenda, meaning that each the Bills and Overtures Committee look at how committees move things so just to consent agenda, so they kind of streamline the process, and those like other consent agendas can be moved out. So one of the ones that the PSNE endorsed was the $1 billion for Peace pledge, which is an interdenominational interfaith group material, psychological, cultural, religious, and ecological well-being of all peoples. We declare our organizational intention to pursue sustainable peace in our work and our lives. So it's quite lovely. It's it had some recommendations to PCUSA churches and our mission agency to really work to establishing and implementing comprehensive strategies for contributing to the mitigation and causes and effects of climate change. So went through pretty easily. That was exciting. Another interesting one was on becoming free from plastic pollution, which I found intriguing. And I was kind of happily surprised to see that it was not controversial at all, but I envisioned that that will find this harder to come to agreement and adoption. And so the General Assembly is encouraging everyone to move from a disposable culture to a reusable, sustainable one, free from plastic pollution. We're asking people to reduce the use of single-use plastics and packaging and water bottles, and encouraging all of our church to find new actions and strategies, and to move away from all of that. And I think that will be an interesting journey for some congregations, particularly given smaller congregations who have fewer members to do things like clean up and wash dishes and such. But a huge move forward for the climate and God's creation. So that one moved forward relatively easily. There were also we also heard about a paper from the Advisory Committee on Social Witness and Policy that about lithium mining, which was very interesting, and how, and also a report from them on the costs of green transitions. And so that was interesting to see these reports coming back after the 225th Assembly that talk about the importance of moving to a green transition and such, and away from fossil fuels, but the fact that there are significant costs associated with becoming a green planet, green consumers. It's particularly where it applies to Indigenous peoples, and how lithium is often mined in places where our most vulnerable live.
Right.
So those were really interesting. Another one is that we met with someone from the Department of the Treasury, talking with us about the Inflation Reduction Act, and asking for time at Assembly to actually meet and do a presentation to everyone. And so I would encourage all of our churches to kind of check that out, because there are many ways to use funds from the Inflation Reduction Act, including like putting solar panels or buying a church van, that there are monies of nonprofits, which is very unusual. And they are eager to get the money into people's hands. And with the upcoming election, now is the time, so that the potential, if that were not to get carried forward, that we would have access to that money now. And then finally, our
the big ticket item.
Contentious and the big ticket item, I say.
You're saving the best for last, Nicole. Go for it.
Best for last. All about divestment from fossil fuels.
Yes.
And, PSNE endorsed Environmental Environment 02, which was on the removal of investments in and subsidies for fossil fuels. And then there was a related overture that came from MRTI. Shannon, remind me, my brain's a
The
little
Mission
bit dull.
Responsibility through Investment team. So that's our national church team that looks at investments. So yeah.
Thank you.
And Nicole, if you can get a little closer to wherever your mic is, you're cutting out just a little bit. We don't want to lose you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Hotel room. So so the second one that was related to divestments was a report to the Assembly that came from MRTI that talked about how they wanted to apply policy and continuing corporate engagement. And so there was a little bit of disconnect, and we heard from scientists and we heard from MRTI about the effects of climate change and the immediate need to stop the use of fossil fuels. And so we at the committee level, we ended up sending O2 on with approval that we wanted MRTI to divest from all fossil fuels. Any company that was profited and was, using research with fossil fuels. But we ran into some issues even at the committee work, which is some of what maybe we can talk about later. But there were some technology issues. We're not meeting in person. There was some leadership, maybe confusion about how to use the technology and how to move forward. And when we ended up moving it forward, there was some confusion even at the committee level that then took up a massive amount of time at assembly with lots of confusion. And so we asked that MRTI divest from fossil fuels, which is something is not the normal procedure. Normally, MRTI likes to work with companies to get companies, be engaged with them and get them to make positive changes by engaging with them and not necessarily divesting and not having a seat at the table to talk with them. There are certain areas where we have divested completely with gun manufacturers and tobacco. And this is another area where we felt strongly that we needed to just make this other category to divest from. And MRTI was completely opposed and very resistant to that. So in the end, we passed it at assembly. We started talking about 06, which kind of scaled things back. And we went back and voted again. We reconsidered 02, and then it was not passed. It was re-voted. And as you can imagine, that was a lot of polity and Robert's rules and painful discourse. And so we ended up amending the 06 document that asks MRTI to identify identify the top 10 fossil fuel companies that derive the majority of their profits from the exploration, development, and production of fossil fuels, and with which there will be no promise immediately divest from those companies. So that is the amendment that was added, but in general, they are going to continue moving forward to try to engage with companies. One of the issues that was of interest is that ConocoPhillips works in some of their fields, have impacted some vulnerable people, and we have been able, at the MRTI has been able to work with some of the oil companies to provide resolution to people who have been impacted. And that was one of the things that actually was a turning point for others. If we were to divest, we would not be able to work with some of those members of our community who wanted us to be an intermediary. And so that was somewhat problematic for some commissioners.
Yeah. Thanks, Nicole. I mean, it was a big lift, the environmental committee, and this issue of fossil fuel divestment, whether it's like a complete categorical divestment or piecemeal. This has been, something we've debated over multiple assemblies and have a lot of feelings about around the church. So, so thanks for your work on that. It'll be interesting to see what comes next of all of those things. It'll be very interesting. And tell us about your committee. You also were on a committee with a lot of hot topics. Both of our commissioners got assigned to hot topic committees. So you were, I think, on one of the most watched ones, and you were also chairing it, the Polity Committee, which is where we considered, changes to our sort of church law and church organizational structure. So what were you all up to? What was in front of you? And what was it like chairing through all of the things that were in front of you?
Well, the Polity Committee was a surprise to me when I received that assignment. And first thing I did was ask the co-moderators, how in the world did you pick me for this committee? And they did not have a good reason, except that one of them knew me and said she's trustworthy. So that was kind of how that happened. I thought, well, thanks a lot for that. But
yeah,
because I knew what was coming. We had 11 items of business on our agenda, and because everything we do changes the book of order, we're not able to put things on a consent agenda. We have to bring everything to the assembly. And we had a really, really incredible team of people to work with. And we had some amazing advocates that we heard from as well. We realized early on that much of the business that we were dealing with were people from the margins trying to get to the middle. And our new stated clerk, G&O, spoke to us about this in our training, and then also in her remarks as she accepted the election as clerk. A word called liminality, people trying to get from, the edges, which can be very creative and but more to the center. So the main topic that we had to work with, of course, was Polity 01. This was an amendment that has to kind of raise the issue of the ordination of LGBTQ people, to Q plus I people in our denomination. And right now there's quite a strong local option. We had a really great discussion in our committee after we heard from our advocates, and Kate was actually one of the advocates. So it would be great to hear from her about how that felt. I know that I was really extremely proud to have our clerk there. And everybody that she worked with did an incredible job of advocacy. We also heard some really heartfelt conversation in our committee. There were LGBTQI plus people there, of course, and later on at the end, one of them remarked that the assembly had provided a support group for him and others who were gay to kind of gather in the evenings after the business was done. And he found that incredibly helpful because it was hard for him to hear some of the discussion. There were 2 Korean pastors on the committee, both of whom spoke up strongly in favor of putting a big chunk of the historic principles in the overture, so that for them, and they are still in conversation with among themselves and with the denomination about about ordination standards, so that they could remain in the PCUSA while they continue to discern their way forward. And in the committee, it failed, but in the assembly, it passed. We basically sent this overture to the assembly by splitting it in half. And the first half basically inserted a non-discrimination clause into a long list of things that we may not discriminate against for people that are members of congregations and they're in good standing. And then we passed that unanimously. And then the second part, we did some amending, but sent it to the assembly basically intact, but inserting the first part into the second part as part of the standards for ordination questions. Then the assembly basically went through exactly the same process without hearing from the advocates that we did. And one of our committee members actually asked, not one of our committee members, but endorsed it, but one of the other committee chair moderators, who himself is a gay, identifies as a gay man, put back in the historical principles because he wanted to specifically allow for that conversation to continue, because in his experience, and others echoed this, that without that conversation, change is virtually impossible. So he wanted to provide that opportunity for people to say in. And there was one of my favorite moments of grace in the assembly, where I lived into hope. The theme was a pastor who stood up and actually kind of choked up at the grace extended to him, because he would vote against the amendment, the overture, but he was very strongly aware that he was being extended more grace than he was willing to extend at this particular time. So that was probably the thing that we had the most angst about and spent the most time on, but also was extremely emotional. 2 of the committee members, 2 of the leadership team members, I'm sorry, had transgender children. And so we had a lot of time together, of course, outside of the time we were on Zoom, and we had a lot of processing to do on our own. There were quite a few tears shed as we listened. and remembered and shared our own experiences, and a sense of, I would say, weariness that we were here again. But
Mm.
I tried to maintain complete, I guess, nonpartisanship, guess would be the best word. And
Mm.
I found out later from one of the younger members of our team that there was actually a WhatsApp chat group going on among some of the people. And this was surprising because nobody had anybody else's contact information, but people could find each other. And they were all chatting about, how does Anne really feel about this issue? And they couldn't figure it out. So I felt like that was a proof positive that I had done my job. The other
It's
thing,
really hard to do that though, Anne, and I just want to say that takes a toll of its own kind, right? Because I mean, I know you have strong feelings about these, issues of inclusion and in the church, and so and have always been someone who's been working on issues of inclusion in the church. And so
yeah,
um and have, members of your own family who are in the LGBTQ community, right? So I just want to say, like, I watched you moderate that, and I would have done the same thing you did. I would have tried so hard to maintain that neutrality, but I'm not sure I could have done it. It's really hard to do when you're put into a role like that and asked to lead in that way. And so just thank you for doing that. I know it was a lot, and I heard from folks around the denomination that they were really grateful for that. And it was a hard spot to be in, really hard spot.
thank you. It was, it was tiring to
Mhm.
maintain that neutrality. However, one of the things that provided was an incredible empowerment of the committee members. Every once in a while during that
Right.
conversation, somebody would say something that I would have immediately jumped down their throat practically had I had the opportunity. And we would often, there were also advocates there from some of the advisory councils who were texting uh, the some of the other leadership team, and they were like, they want to talk about this. And I would be like, no, nope. And every time a member
Mhm.
of the committee would step in and say what I wanted to say, and just living into the trusting the committee was an incredible experience for me personally, and I was grateful. They're such thoughtful, caring people.
Mhm.
We did a lot prior to the commission and finding out who one another were, and we found out that three-quarters of us were introverts. So we used a lot of small group and informal conversation to process a lot of the things, and we formed an incredible covenant of for listening and caring, and it just played all the way through. It was really a powerful experience for me personally, and I think everybody on the committee got great feedback. And something really great. I'll tell you this later when we get off. I need to keep talking about what we did, but there's some wonderful experiences in the committee that I'd love to tell
Mm.
about. Never make it to the plenary. Another place that we talked about that was touchy was an overture that came that wanted to mandate naming people who had been accused of sexual abuse or harassment of a minor or an adult with diminished capacity. And normally this is not done because the statistics, the few that we have show that 95% of the time their charges are not drawn. So using a person's name could definitely, we know the story, once your name is out there, it's hard to move on from that if
Right.
you've even been suspected. So what we did was follow the advice of the advisory council and insert another part of the book of order that would not mandate uh, the naming of a person, but clarified what has to happen in the
Mhm.
process, which was to insert a part of the book of order that mandates a clerk to report even the suspicion of that type of abuse to the civil authorities. It didn't accomplish exactly what the overture advocates were trying to accomplish, but we felt that based on your comments, a lot of what you said, because you were an advocate for this committee, and some other you know, there were tons of other stories that were told as we talked amongst ourselves that, and concerns about confidentiality and so
Yeah.
forth that led us to this kind of middle road, and that went to the assembly and went through. I won't talk about everything that we did, but there were some others that I thought were very interesting. Let me just pull one up here. That we
And I
had.
want to note, Anne, that, the Polity 01, that this question of the changes to the Book of Order, because, it needs the assent of the entire denomination. Some of your things like that are going to come back to the presbyteries for their votes over the next 12 months.
Everything in our
Yes,
list will.
we'll come back, and so we'll have an opportunity as a presbytery to vote on these things along with every other presbytery around the PCUSA, and only once we have all those votes in and we see if they've met that 3/4 mark nationally among the votes of the presbyteries, will we find out if they're completely ratified and part of our Book of Order. So more to come on these things, and we'll be doing our votes in 2025 at one of our meetings of the presbytery before the summer of 2025. So we'll be having conversations again in this presbytery about some of these things exactly. So you had a lot before you, Anne.
We did. Some of the other things were having to do with pastoral relationships. There was one about dissolution that we no longer nobody can be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which was something that was already happening at OGA and PMA, and now it's coming to the presbyteries for their
Right.
ratification. Also, changing temporary pastoral assignments from 12 months to 36 months. That was an interesting discussion because some people said, what about negotiating salary for that pastor every year, as happens now? How are we going to make sure that those things are considered? So there were some other things too about the Lord's Supper, whether or not you could really continue to do that now that COVID was over and online. And the advice was yes, but we're going to refer it to the Office of Theology and Worship for them to make some comments and bring something back to the 227th. So, I could go on, but
all over the map.
yeah, we were all over the map, and it was
Yeah.
all interesting stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Anne. So
Sure.
Kate, kind of rounding up this portion of the conversation, this was your first General Assembly in this role as stated clerk that you've been at for a year now. And I didn't go to the assembly in person this year. I was online for portions of it, but I was in a very low-key role this time for the first time in my life at GA. So tell us about what you were doing, because you were the staff person at GA, and up to other things, as Anne said, testifying and doing some other work. What was it like for you being at GA in this new role?
So as someone who has followed GA for many years back, even when I was a youth elder, it was I really was glad to have the opportunity just to be there and to be in the back of the assembly hall sitting with other clerks and other presbytery leaders. My primary role was just as a resource person to our commissioners, to Nicole and Anne, and also to the commissioners and the YAD who came from Boston Presbytery, to be there just when somebody wanted to chat about something, think through something, answered a couple polity questions along the way. In that role, very much keeping my stated clerk supplying information and not interfering with anybody's vote and their conferring with their conscience and the Holy Spirit, but mostly just participating in worship, watching business unfold, really for me getting the closest view I've had of how GA does its business, and really just appreciating that opportunity to see the church do its work and to be reminded of even given the imperfection of the process, of how much love and faithfulness and diligence and
Mm.
deep thoughtfulness that goes into this process of how we share power as Presbyterians. I just really love that. I also, as Anne mentioned, had the opportunity to serve on behalf of PSNE as an overture advocate for Polity 1 for the overture about diversity and inclusion, adding both language about gender identity and sexual orientation to the diversity and inclusion clause of the foundations portion of the Book of Order. And then, as Anne talked about in more detail, adding some uh, requirements for discussion around examinations for ordination. And
Mm.
so in that case, I really did get to say my opinion. And I really was so grateful to
Great.
be able to watch
Mm.
the proceedings of the Polity Committee on that portion. I just was really truly impressed with the way that the committee worked. The chair did a great job too. And
We might happen to know her, right? Yeah.
yes, yes. And there was a group, there were 8 presbyteries and 2 synods that concurred with this presbytery. So of those, there were I believe about 7 of us who spoke and were able to coordinate a presentation trying to speak to why we believe that the committee should bring this overture before the assembly, and why we believe ultimately we hope that presbyteries will make these changes to the Book of Order as the assembly has amended and passed those, and to speak to questions that commissioners had about what the what we understand the meaning and intent and impact of these particular Book of Order changes would be. And I definitely found that sort of presentation anxiety producing to be part of, honestly, but I really was grateful to be part of that.
Mm.
And as somebody who's pretty constantly aware how previous waves of advocacy for LGBTQIA inclusion in the church make a really material difference in my own life, are why I'm able to be in this role and on this podcast today.
Mm.
I was glad to have sort of a new way for my own participation in that ongoing work of inclusion.
Mm.
And so that portion was on Zoom. By the time we got to Salt Lake City, my role as overture advocate was pretty much wrapped up. But it was really I was grateful for that.
You did a great job with your testimony, Kate. I was
Thank
glad
you.
to be able to be in the Zoom room when you did it. I had still my fancy credentials, so I could not be watching on the live stream on YouTube with a million gazillion people, but be in the more intimate Zoom room when that was going on. And it was really an honor to be there and watch you talk and offer your testimony, because it's really important to do that at GA. And it is, I think, that personal testimony that we're there for. So it's our polity, it's how we express ourselves in the church, and how we continue to bring more light. So so I'm grateful, really grateful, Kate, that you were able to do that, and to sort of be able to be as present as possible in that sort of online forum. We talked a little bit about some of the hot topics at GA, and I know there's a lot of other things that happen, but I want to, just kind of keep chatting about some of the big picture stuff. We always elect new co-moderators at each General Assembly. We used to elect a moderator and vice moderator, but then once we elected co-moderators, we've never gone back, which is, I think, a good thing. And this GA, we were electing a new stated clerk, which is not something that happens all that often. And so what was that like? Tell us about our new stated clerk. our new co-moderators. What do you think about these three new leaders that we have for the Presbyterian Church?
The moderators of the committees and vice moderators had access to G&O, our new clerk,
Uh-huh.
you know, in between, before the, so forth and so on. So I had a meeting with her and had some discussions with her, and she did a lot of our leadership training. And I think she is going to be an amazing
Yes.
stated clerk.
Yes.
The thing that's so wonderful about her is her centeredness.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that know her well, and I know some people who know her well, say that she is also an iron fist, that she cottons no nonsense. You
Right.
know,
Yes, that's very true.
and she will, she's going to have this, you know, crap show, excuse my language, of
Yeah.
unification, which was also another hot topic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for such a time as this, she's going to be a breath. She's gonna somehow get the Holy Spirit in the whole thing. I just know it.
Well, she's going to be very important for the unification work, I can say, because I'm,
Yeah.
as you all know, rotating off as co-chair of the Mission Agency Board, which is one of the two agencies being unified. And one of the big pieces of work that's been going on behind the scenes the last 12 months has been a unification table of the senior staff leadership. And so, of course, Jihan has been a big part of that table. And so with her being the nominee and now elected as stated clerk, it actually allows that to be very seamless. We're not bringing someone new who hasn't sat at that table for a year and hasn't been part of those conversations and hasn't picked through those the hard parts and the pieces they've been working on. And so it is really going to, from that almost administrative role, make it pretty seamless and relational role. And so much of that unification work is really falling on the heads of agencies and their senior deputies. And so, making sure those places at the table don't change over the next 12 months is going to be very important to unification because of the continuity that's needed. And then that allows the process to pick, where we're going in the future, but also have, a good foundation as we move forward. So I think it's going to create a pretty drama-free situation, which is important for this unification process. So I know in the background that's going to be really important. Along with her, as you said, non-anxious presence, just really gifted for this moment. And she's also Korean, so that helps a lot with pulling the disparate pieces of the church together, I think. So she's an exciting nominee, and I
She's not
was
a nominee anymore.
not a nominee anymore. I know. I lived with her as a nominee for so many months ahead of GA. I'm so used to that. But it was we were, doing a lot of work with that team, and it was exciting to see where they landed in the end. So yeah. About the co-moderators, what did you all think of our co-moderators? These are sort of our volunteer leaders for the next 2 years, doing all sorts of things. I don't know them too well, but I'm curious what you all thought of them.
Yeah, they're very different people. Very, I think that they did a good job leading the assembly. CC in particular, I think, had a really good feel for where the commissioners were when they needed a break, when there was confusion, when to call on more people. I think that, if you followed assembly at all, you saw that the Frozen Chosen actually danced
Mm-hmm.
at assembly. So CC had a couple of breaks where people needed to get up and stretch, and so led us in the electric slide and some other dance things, and that happened on several occasions, and actually was really a nice way to have a little bit of space and some levity in the midst of some really hard discussions and stuff. And they're going to be around for a while, because one of the votes was that we elect co-moderators at the end of assembly. And so CC and Tony will actually be moderating the 227th assembly as well, and we'll elect new co-moderators after that. But they did a great job. It's a really difficult process if you've not had to moderate a large group like that in the midst of trying to follow things on a computer screen and the very typical technical difficulties. But very personable. I enjoyed them very much.
That's great. So what about joys? What did you all come away with as sort of joys from GA? What got you excited? Usually people go to assembly and find out something that's really interesting or exciting to them about, work the PCUSA is doing that maybe they didn't know before. What were some of those aha moments or joyful moments that you came away from General Assembly with, things that were energizing?
You want to go in?
Sure. Or Kate, did you have something you wanted to put in?
Sure, but you all can go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Everybody's so polite
I
on this podcast.
yes,
We learned how to be polite.
I know,
General
I know.
Assembly.
I
ahead, Kate.
really appreciated connecting with folks from across the country and just hearing about people's experiences in different geographical spots. I I think we'll talk more about this later in the podcast, but really, really, really appreciated the work of the Presbytery of Utah, and the church that I visited on Sunday morning was just lovely. I was really glad to see some of the ways I think that over now this was, my first GA in this particular role, but over the years compared to some previous GAs, some clarity and some courage, and some ways that things that were that might have been controversial in past years were just on the consent agenda, and that seeing the diversity and inclusion and clear liberation focus of some of our preachers, some of our speakers, a lot of the liturgy and worship, I just was really moved by a lot of that.
It was
I'll go
great.
next.
It felt like the old guard had moved on, right? Even though there
Yeah.
were still whiteheads on the plenary floor. One of the best moments for me happened in committee. We had worship every day, twice a day, and there was a young woman who was a chaplain at one of our Presbyterian related universities in South Dakota. Her name is Doodle Harris. Love that name. And she said, as a chaplain, she discovered that most of her students wanted to worship privately. So she said, I'm going to lead worship like I do for them. And she put a QR code up on the screen and she said, scan this with your phones or click the link if you want to use your computer. And she led us through this worship service. And because it was great. I mean, it was very well done with prayer, scripture, and then you'd get a screen with a question and you could give 3 answers. And those, as you put the answers in, it would shift to a new screen that was creating a word cloud
Oh,
of everybody that came in. So we had 50 people in our room with the leadership team and the committee, but a bunch of people who were watching the live stream joined us because they could get on with their phone. And so we had way over 100 people worshiping with us. It was just so beautiful. I was so, that kind of innovation, I think. And I think the app is called Aha. And so it was a real aha moment. I'll have to find out. I'll find out what it is, because it would be a great thing to use for presbytery worship sometime too.
yeah, that's really fun.
Yeah, was.
So mine is very similar. I appreciated worship at Wasatch Presbyterian Church. So General Assembly this year did not have an opening worship. They sent us off to area churches. They bussed us off, and I went with some new friends who had chosen the same church, and I found it completely energizing and just phenomenal. The vulnerability of the preacher and the music, and we had lunch together. It was lovely. Each church, had a catered lunch so we could meet members of the church as well as our new friends. And it is such a small world. I actually sat behind other visitors who are from West Hartford, Connecticut.
Wow.
So, and that's kind of like what I thought throughout the assembly. Like, really, the Presbyterian Church is such a small, like there are connections everywhere.
Yes.
So I'll close with that because you've got more questions.
No, no, it's okay. Just rounding up, were there any like worries you came away with? I hate to always ask the negative question, but I'm just curious, were there things where you said, oh, I wonder how this will go, or I worry about this piece for the church, or things like that?
I have a big concern.
Yeah.
Um, I know that I know for a fact, because I spoke to quite a few people about this, but the software that we use to make motions, to be engaged in the discussion,
Uh-huh.
there were people there, mostly my age, and I'm 70 or older,
Mm,
just resigned themselves to not being able to participate because they were constrained by the technology.
uh,
And we have to figure that out.
yeah.
That is, there was such you used the word vulnerability of the preacher, Nicole, and I felt like there was a lot of vulnerability.
Mm,
But we have to figure out a way for people who are just never going to be quick enough. Even I'm not quick enough. I tried a couple times to send an amendment in, and the moderators and the technology move so quickly, and there are people that are far more adept at it than me that could get in there. But I think that unless we can figure out a way for people to participate without technology, um, there has to be a both and in the church. I am always saying, we're not going to be able to include everybody we need to
yeah.
include.
Yeah. It creates some opportunities, but it also creates more barriers at
It
some level.
does. I mean, I
Yeah.
think the committees on Zoom are great because of the breadth and depth of people that can come and go, and it's hard to get people to commit to 12 days or 11
Yeah.
days. And so,
Mm.
but the technology you're right. We've got to figure that out.
I think my worry is the same. And I think that that was the frustration I felt at our committee level as well as at assembly, and the
Mhm.
confusion, because there was no way to volunteer information. Like Robert's rules is adhered to in a very strict fashion, which is
Mhm.
important. But also, like at the committee level, we were muted, and there was no chat, and there was no, so if they weren't seeing, like, I felt like our moderators had these little tiny screens and were not seeing when people had questions or wanted to offer information. It was very, very limiting and time consuming, because one of us could have addressed the concern verbally and been done with something that would take 40 minutes sometimes to
Mm.
like go seeking clarity in a different fashion. And I appreciate the fact that we could do the first part on Zoom with its faults, but again, having a massive COVID outbreak, at the assembly level, and like, so what that looks like, finding commissioners, perhaps, like, who wants to go. Like, I kind of assumed I would have COVID when I came home. I did. And so, but there's not always going to be people who feel comfortable putting themselves in a situation where that
Right.
might happen. So that's a concern as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. A lot of people
You
came
got
home.
you got COVID too, didn't you, Kate?
Yeah.
I did, and that was the concern I was going to raise as
Yeah.
well.
We were batting
Nicole,
2 for 3 on that,
Is
right?
yes, is
Yeah, the old lady didn't get it. Woohoo!
is while I, am grateful to be mostly, nearly completely recovered, and knew that this was a risk going in, I do think that between and I'm so grateful that COVID isn't what it was in 2020 or even 22. I think going from very strict restrictions for the gatherings in 22 to having
Mhm.
really not even a lot of tracking or guidance, and very much a
Yeah.
free-for-all in this assembly. I hope that going into 26, whatever COVID looks like, and other viruses that spread in the summer,
Sure.
and that organizers will be able to come up with some ways. Nothing's going to be 100%, but some ways to thoughtfully maybe stem that spread in a way that at least would allow someone who is particularly vulnerable to severe disease to participate, other than just saying, this isn't for me, I got to stay home.
Right.
And so I think that that's a question we need to be asking on every level of the church, and have been
Yeah.
thinking about that a lot in the last couple of weeks.
And it's an interesting question, right? Because you all are technically like volunteering to go to GA. I mean, it's kind of your job, Kate, to go to GA. Like it's kind of my job to go to GA. But at the end of the day, if we don't go, it's not like a fireable offense, right? But we get commissioners to volunteer, but then there's all this staff where they really are required to be there. The staff of the assembly, staff of committees, all sorts of other people. And I know that there's some of those folks who have had long COVID from the pandemic and had some really significant issues, and then have to be back in, situations, and then ended up contracting it again. And so, these become, questions and things to think about. And, definitely, I was, just watching how many people are coming home, sick. And I've talked to a number of colleagues, and I've been doing a bunch of reference checks the last couple weeks because we've had two churches finishing up searches in the presbytery. So I've been talking to a lot of my presbytery executive colleagues around the country doing these executive checks, and everyone starts the conversation with, "Did you get COVID at General Assembly?" And my response is, "Well, I actually didn't go physically to GA." So, and then I asked them how they are, and almost all of them had it, and so, so it's been,
Well,
I've been talking to these colleagues, and that's the thing that everybody's sort of, they're talking more about that than about the actual work of the assembly too.
Well, and I found a reluctance among the leadership there to talk about it. Nicole got sick
Yes.
right before I was supposed to go up and give my report. So my
Mhm.
co-moderator and I made the decision to wear masks on the stage because it was sort of glanced at,
Yes.
by Bronwyn one time. But after that, I went in and before I was going back for the second time, and I said, I think you need to address this more directly. There's a lot of COVID out there. Oh, we have 10 confirmed cases. I said, there's more than that. Well, we're following the CDC guidelines. And I said, well, I take groups to places, and I know for a fact the CDC does not have any suggestions for large group activities. But
Right.
you have to do it, and well, there's 40 masks. I mean, there's masks that you can get them. They're at the registration desk. There were 40 masks, and they would only give me 25. And I took them and I handed them out to elderly Black people, elderly Asian people, people from other countries whose vaccines may or may not be as good as the ones we can get here in the US, or maybe they never even had them. Who knows? So that was it. There were
Yeah.
no masks. So I was disappointed in the fact that they didn't come out and say there are at least 10 confirmed cases, which means there are many more. So if you have a KN95 mask, please put it on. And we would appreciate it. That's all that, I mean, that might have helped a little bit, but
Yeah,
anyway.
it was an unfortunate way to
Yeah.
end as, things were going. And it was only kind of guaranteed to happen because you're flying in people from all over the country, and a lot of people,
All over the
from
world.
all over the world as well. I mean, it's I know my mom was traveling just before GA because her sister was sick and passed away in California. And my mom, her doctor said, "You're just going to get sick if you get on a plane. You've got to wear double masks, but I understand you need to go. This is a family emergency." But, her doctor was saying, it's like a guarantee right now. There's so much out there from from an epidemiology, perspective as a doctor. I assume any patient I have who gets on a plane is going to get it, and then take it wherever they are around the country. So it was bound to happen. And it
I got
was,
lucky. That's all I can say.
it was a concern. Yeah. Well, Anne, all I can say is, you just said you were the old lady in the group. So maybe being the old lady is the good thing. Like you've had more time to build up your immune system.
Well, and I probably had more vaccines than anybody too. I just had a vaccine about 2 months ago.
Yeah.
I go every 4 months.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't want to get it again.
The
Ugh.
privileges of age, you get more shots, right? So, well, as we close up, I just want to offer, is there anything else that we want to throw on the table to share with people about GA? I know we talked about a lot of things and there's never enough time to get to anything, but just, is there anything else we want to, share as we wrap this up with those who might be listening to the podcast about what it was like going to General Assembly.
Well, I have one thing I would like to say, and that's based on the advocacy that you gave when we were considering Overture 2. And I think that it might behoove our presbytery to write an overture to the next General Assembly, requesting a lot of the information that you spoke about that is non-existent, kind of a database for when cases are filed and how they go, because the advocates who wrote the overture really couldn't find much information. So maybe we can work together in the presbytery on something like that. I
Sure.
think that would be great.
Yeah, I saved my testimony, so
Good.
if it's useful.
It is. I think
That was a hard piece of testimony for me to offer, but I'm glad I was able to offer it to the committee. So
it was
uh,
powerful.
yeah, so I'm glad I was able to come and talk to them.
I would
Anything
say
else?
I would highly recommend going.
Yeah.
It's I think people should volunteer to go. It was
Mhm.
incredibly moving. I found that there was several opportunities where it was very emotional when
Yeah.
Jihan was elected and when we voted to approve the Transgender Day of Visibility on the Presbyterian planning calendar. I was just crying, just thinking about friends who are trans and as Kate mentioned earlier, like things that were just so complicated and contentious before that were just kind of easy this time. But it was incredibly powerful, incredibly exhausting, but lots of great connections, and I would highly recommend it.
Me too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great experience, and I hope we can send equally fabulous commissioners in just under 2 years' time to the next assembly, which will be in Milwaukee. Is that correct? Milwaukee.
Correct.
Yes.
So we'll be going to the land of cheese, if that's a
Hey, I was born there. I'm a proud cheesehead.
yeah, so if that's an incentive to anyone, if they're a cheese addict like I am, then they can come to General Assembly in 2
Well,
years.
it's brats and cheese, not just
Brats
cheese.
and cheese. Well,
Brats
you know,
and-
the cheese part I'm into. So, well, thank you all so much for being part of our GA team. It was really, you represented the presbytery so well. We're so grateful to each of you for going and for being part of this, deliberative process. And we'll be working on some of those pieces, like I said, doing our own voting in 2025 as a presbytery. So more to come on all of those pieces, and look forward to seeing what new things will happen with the life of the church. So thank you for being at GA. We're so grateful to each of you for your ministry, and thanks for being on the podcast and being part of connecting our conversations. Thanks, everyone.
Welcome.